The wind screamed like a dying woman around Schloss Ehrenstein that October night in 1936. Lightning clawed the sky, revealing for one frozen instant the silhouette of a cloaked figure on the battlements. Then darkness swallowed it again. Inside the locked West Tower, Graf Conrad von Ehrenstein poured brandy with steady aristocratic hands, unaware that in exactly 11 minutes he would be dead. The clock struck midnight. A single blood-freezing wail rose from the stones themselves. When the door was broken down 20 minutes later, the Graf lay stabbed through the heart. The door had been bolted from within, the windows were barred, and the dust upon the floor remained utterly undisturbed. Chapter 1. The Little Belgian Arrives. The mist clung to the river Neckar like a guilty secret when the Berlin-Basel Express sighed into Heidelberg Hauptbahnhof at 23 minutes past 9 on a damp October morning in 1936. Porters in peaked caps shouted in hoarse Swabian, their breath pluming white in the cold, while the great locomotive exhaled steam that smelled of coal and distant mountains. Among the handful of passengers who descended onto the wet platform, one figure stood out at once. A small, immaculately dressed man no taller than 5'4", wrapped in a fur-collared overcoat of exquisite cut, his patent leather shoes gleaming despite the drizzle. His head crowned by a stiff bowler hat tilted at the precisely correct angle. His mustaches, magnificent, symmetrical, fiercely waxed, curled upward with the serene confidence of banners above a victorious army. Hercule Poirot had arrived. He paused on the bottom step of the carriage, surveying the scene with bright green eyes that missed nothing. A news vendor was crying the morning's Völkischer Beobachter. Two brown-shirted youths lounged against a pillar, smoking and watching the travelers with lazy arrogance. An elderly Jesuit in rusty black hurried past, clutching a breviary. Poirot's nostrils flared delicately. Germany had changed since his last visit in 1929. There was a hardness in the air, a metallic taste like blood on a coin. Yet crime, he reflected with satisfaction, remained eternal, and an impossible murder even more so. A young woman detached herself from the shadow of the station clock and approached with the hesitant dignity of one who has not slept. She was perhaps 25, tall and slender, dressed in severe black relieved only by a single silver brooch at the throat. Her fair hair was drawn back beneath a small black hat, and her eyes, gray, direct and ringed with fatigue, fixed upon the little Belgian with something between hope and dread. Monsieur Poirot? Her French was excellent, only the faintest roll of the German R betraying her origin. I am Lieselot von Ehrenstein. My uncle's telegram reached you? Poirot removed his gray suede glove and inclined his head with the gravity due to mourning. Mademoiselle, permit me to offer my condolences most profound. The Graf von Ehrenstein was a gentleman of the old school. His death is a tragedy. That it should be accompanied by circumstances so bizarre. This is an outrage against order itself. I have come, as requested. She pressed her lips together as though to stop them trembling. They said you would refuse. That no foreigner would cross the border now. That even you, even I? Poirot's eyebrows rose like drawn bows. Mademoiselle, when the impossible announces itself, Hercule Poirot becomes most obstinate. A man stabbed in a locked tower, the door bolted from within, no weapon discovered, no footprints in the dust save those of the victim himself, and all the while a ghost wails upon the battlements. Mon Dieu, it is irresistible. It cries out for the little gray cells. A faint flush touched her pale cheeks. Then you do not dismiss the ghost? I dismiss nothing until I have examined it, he replied, tapping his temple with one manicured finger. Come. The carriage, it awaits. She led him across the wet cobbles to where a black Daimler stood, its bonnet adorned with the Ehrenstein crest. A double-headed eagle clutching a broken sword. The chauffeur, a thick-set man with a face like carved oak, leapt to open the door. Poirot paused before entering, gazing up at the hills beyond the town. Through drifting scarves of mist, the ruined castle of Heidelberg glowed faintly red in the morning light. But higher still, upon its own crag above the river, a darker shape loomed. Schloss Ehrenstein, black against the sky, windows blind, towers jagged as broken teeth. "It watches," Lieselot said quietly, following his gaze. "It has always watched. But since my uncle died, it watches with different eyes." Poirot gave a small, complacent smile. "Castles do not possess eyes, mademoiselle. Only men do, and one pair of those eyes, I think, has seen too much." Inside the Daimler, the leather smelled of age and beeswax. As they moved off, Lieselot sat very straight, hands clasped in her lap. Poirot studied her discreetly. Breeding showed in the fine bones, the long neck, the unconscious arrogance of posture. Grief showed in the faint violet shadows beneath her eyes and the way her fingers worried at a small handkerchief already frayed to threads. "Tell me everything," he said gently. "From the beginning. Leave out no detail, however small. The little things, they are too often the most significant." She drew a breath that trembled. "It was the night of the 10th, 3 weeks ago tomorrow. My uncle had been unwell. Not physically, Dr. Kruger insisted there was nothing wrong with his heart, but preoccupied, secretive. He spent more and more time alone in the West Tower, the old watchroom above the chapel. He forbade any of us to disturb him after 10 o'clock. On that night there was a storm, thunder directly overhead, lightning every few seconds. At 11:47, precisely because I looked at the clock in the corridor, the temperature fell as though someone had opened a crypt. Then came the wailing." "The White Lady?" Poirot asked. She nodded. "The castle's ghost. They say she is Anna von Ehrenstein, thrown from the battlements in 1589 by a faithless husband. For centuries she has been heard only at times of violent death in the family. That night she cried as I have never heard, long, heartbroken, rising to a scream. We all heard it. My great-aunt Irmgard, Captain von Richter, even old Marta the housekeeper who is half deaf. My uncle's valet ran to the tower door and hammered upon it. No answer. He fetched an axe. When they broke in..." She closed her eyes. Poirot waited. At last she continued, voice barely above a whisper. "He was seated at his desk, head fallen forward as though asleep. But there was blood, so much blood, pooling beneath the chair and soaking into the turkey carpet. A single wound, straight to the heart. The door had been bolted on the inside. The windows are barred and 30 meters above the rocks. The chimney is too narrow even for a child. And the dust, centuries of dust on that floor, showed only my uncle's own footprints from door to desk and back again the previous day. Nothing else, no dagger, no pistol, nothing. Only a glass of brandy spilled across his papers and the smell of lilac." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Lilac? In October?" "That is what old Marta said. She swears the White Lady always brings the scent of lilac when she comes for one of us." The Daimler was climbing now, winding up the narrow road through vineyards where the leaves had turned the color of dried blood. Poirot removed his hat and smoothed his hair with a small pocket comb. "And the others in the castle that night. Tell me of them." Lieselotte's voice grew careful. "My great-aunt, the Dowager Gräfin Irmgard, she is my grandfather's sister, not my uncle's, and she hated him. He inherited everything when my father died. She believes the title should have passed through the female line to her son, who was killed at Verdun. Then there is Captain Hans von Richter, my uncle's cousin, decorated in the war but penniless now. He came 2 months ago hoping for a loan my uncle refused. Dr. Eberhard Kruger, the family physician, lives in the East Wing. He has been treating my uncle for nervous depression. And the servants, of course, though none sleep on the upper floors. Poirot nodded slowly. 5 persons with opportunity, 3 at least with motive most obvious. And the ghost makes 6. The car emerged from the trees and Schloss Ehrenstein rose before them in all its somber majesty. Walls of blackened stone, Gothic windows like empty eyes, towers crowned with wrought iron vanes that creaked in the wind. Rooks wheeled and cawed about the battlements. As the Daimler swept beneath the arch of the gatehouse, Poirot caught a glimpse of something pale at one of the high windows, a woman's face, he thought, watching their arrival. Then it was gone. The car halted in the courtyard. Liveried footmen appeared with umbrellas. Poirot stepped down, straightened his coat, and looked up at the vast facade. "Eh bien," he murmured, half to himself, half to the waiting castle. "Let us see what secrets you keep behind those old stones. Hercule Poirot is here, and already the little gray cells, they begin to stir." Above him the wind moaned through arrow slits like a woman beginning very softly to weep. Chapter 2. The Castle of Echoes. The great nail-studded door of Schloss Ehrenstein swung inward with a groan that seemed to rise from the very stones, and Hercule Poirot stepped across the threshold into a cavernous hall, where torches had burned for 700 years and the air tasted of damp iron and ancient incense. Suits of armor stood like silent sentries along the walls, their visors blank and blind. Above them tattered banners hung motionless, the gold thread of the double-headed eagle dulled to the color of dead leaves. A vast fireplace yawned beneath a mantel carved with scenes of the Crusades, but the logs within were cold and white with ash, as though no one had dared light a fire since the night of the murder. Every footfall echoed thrice, once from the flagstones, once from the vaulted ceiling, and once more from somewhere deeper, as if the castle itself repeated every human sound in a lower, mocking register. Lieselotte led him toward the staircase, her heels clicking with brittle precision. Yet even her light step provoked an answering clatter far along the corridor, as though an invisible companion kept pace. Poirot's gaze darted left and right, cataloguing. The uneven wear on the stone where generations of Ehrensteins had descended to dinner. The faint rectangular patches on the paneling where portraits had recently been removed. The faint scent again of lilac, so elusive he wondered if it lived only in his imagination. At the foot of the stairs waited the household, arranged like suspects in a tableau vivant, and Poirot felt the old, familiar thrill. Here were the players upon his stage, and one of them, perhaps more than one, had already danced a pas de deux with death. First to advance was the Dowager Gräfin Irmgard von Ehrenstein, a tall woman of 70 with the posture of an empress and hair the color of forged steel drawn back beneath a black lace mantilla. Her face was a map of old aristocratic arrogance, the mouth thin and bloodless, the eyes pale blue and unblinking. She wore mourning as though it were armor, heavy bombazine rustling like serpents, and the great Ehrenstein emeralds glittered coldly at her throat jewels. Poirot noted at once that should by rights have passed to the new heir, yet here they were, still clasped about the neck of a woman who had hated the dead man with medieval intensity. "Monsieur Poirot," she said in French as perfect as it was icy. "We are honored that so celebrated a personage should interest himself in our little domestic tragedy. Though I confess I fail to see what a foreigner can achieve where our own authorities have already declared the matter closed. Suicide while of unsound mind." Poirot bowed with exquisite correctness. "Madame la Comtesse, the German police are admirable in matters of ordinary crime, but the impossible is a speciality that transcends frontiers. I assure you, Hercule Poirot never intrudes where he is not invited. Your niece's telegram was most pressing." A faint sneer touched the dowager's lips, but before she could reply, a second figure limped forward. Captain Hans von Richter, 35 or 36, once handsome in the fair Teutonic fashion, now hollow-cheeked, the iron cross at his throat the only brightness about him. His left sleeve hung empty, pinned neatly to his tunic. The Great War had taken the arm, and it seemed much of the man as well. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from brandy or sleeplessness Poirot could not yet tell, and when he clicked heels the sound was sharp with old military pride. Herr Poirot, your fame precedes you, though I warn you this castle devours detectives as it devours everything else. My cousin Conrad laughed at ghosts, and now he is one. Captain, Poirot murmured, it is not the laughter at ghosts that kills, but the belief that they are harmless. From the shadows near the fireplace shuffled the third principal, Dr. Eberhard Kruger, small and rotund, balding with round spectacles that magnified anxious eyes. He carried a black leather bag as though it were a shield and dabbed continually at his forehead with a handkerchief already soaked. Most distressing, he muttered. The Graf was under my care. I prescribed bromide, complete quiet. If I had suspected suicidal ideation, you would have done precisely nothing, the Dowager cut in, because my brother-in-law was as sane as I am and twice as cunning. He did not kill himself. Someone killed him, and the someone is laughing at us still. A cracked voice rose from the inglenook like the croak of a dying crow. The White Lady took him, I heard her. Same as I heard her the night the old Graf fell down the cellar steps in '89. Same as when young Heinrich was drowned in the well. Old Marta Klein, the housekeeper, was tiny and bent, her face a walnut shell beneath a starched white cap, eyes milky with cataract yet sharp with peasant superstition. She had served the family for 53 years, man and boy, and her gnarled hands twisted a rosary as she spoke. Poirot turned to her with genuine deference. Madame Martha, you are the memory of this house. You will tell Poirot everything you remember, yes? Every creak of the stair, every scent of lilac, every shadow that moved when should not. She crossed herself hurriedly. The lilac is her perfume. Anna von Ehrenstein loved lilac. When she comes, the whole castle smells of it, even in winter. Lieselotte touched Poirot's sleeve. Shall I show you to your room? Or would you prefer to see the tower at once? Poirot considered. Sunlight, thin and cold, slanted through high lancet windows, illuminating centuries of dust that danced like tiny ghosts. Somewhere above, a door slammed, though there was no wind. He smoothed his mustache, sensing the weight of unseen eyes from balconies and galleries. First, he said softly, I think we will take a little tour. A castle that echoes must have excellent acoustics, and acoustics, mademoiselle, can be made to lie most beautifully. As they moved toward the west wing, the household trailing behind like courtiers at an execution, Poirot's sharp ears caught the Dowager's whispered aside to Captain von Richter. If the Belgian meddles too far, we may have another ghost before the week is out. Poirot smiled to himself. Excellent. Already the masks begin to slip. Somewhere in this brooding pile of stone a murderer listened to every word, and the little gray cells were already arranging themselves in perfect, implacable order. Chapter 3. The Locked Tower. Poirot climbed the spiral stair alone, the others forbidden to follow, his small feet finding the worn centers of the stones with the certainty of a man who trusts geometry above emotion. The west tower rose in a tight corkscrew of black oak and iron, each step groaning like a confession. The air grew colder with every turn, as though the stones themselves exhaled the breath of the dead. At the fifth turn he paused, listening. Nothing but the wind worrying at arrow slits and the faint rhythmic drip of water somewhere far below. Yet he felt watched. The sensation prickled the back of his neck like an insect's feet. He resumed climbing, counting the steps, 97 steps exactly from the chapel corridor to the iron-bound door of the watchroom. 97 steps no intruder could have taken without leaving a trace. The door stood ajar, the splintered jamb still bearing the scars of the axe that had shattered the lock 3 weeks earlier. A new hasp and padlock had been fitted, but the key hung obediently on a nail, placed there by Liselot at his request. Poirot slipped it into the lock, turned it with a soft click that echoed like a pistol shot, and stepped inside. Then, with deliberate theater, he closed the door behind him, drew the bolt across, and stood motionless in the sudden hush, letting the room speak. It was a round chamber 20 feet across, its walls pierced by 4 narrow lancet windows barred with ancient iron. The floor was flagstone covered by a single threadbare Turkey carpet the color of dried blood. A heavy oak desk faced the western window. Upon it lay scattered papers, a spilled brandy glass still bearing a faint amber stain, and a brass telescope pointed toward the river far below. A high-backed chair stood behind the desk, its leather seat darkened by a much larger stain that had soaked through to the flags beneath. The stain of Graf Conrad von Ehrenstein's life, Poirot reflected, had been remarkably thorough. He began with the door. The bolt was massive, hand-forged, the iron thick as his thumb. When thrown, it slid into a socket chiseled deep into the stone. He examined the screws that held the socket. Old, pitted, but undisturbed. No sign of tampering. The keyhole beneath was similarly innocent. The wards were worn smooth by centuries of use, yet the lock turned sweetly. He knelt, took a small electric torch from his pocket, and studied the floor immediately inside the threshold. Dust, thick, undisturbed, gray as ash of decades, lay in a perfect arc described by the door's swing. Only one set of footprints crossed it. The broad, aristocratic impressions of the Graf's evening shoes, entering the evening before his death and never leaving again. Poirot moved to the windows. Each was barred by vertical iron set into the stone at intervals too narrow for even a child's head. The glass was thick and wavy, the leading intact. Centuries of storm had pitted the outer surface, but nothing had been broken or forced. He tested the bars, solid, immovable. From the sill he could see the river Neckar glinting far below like a drawn steel and the sheer drop of 200 feet to the rocks. No ledge, no ivy, no possibility of entrance or exit. The fireplace next. A small Gothic arch containing nothing but cold ash and one charred fragment of rope too brittle to identify. The chimney narrowed sharply 6 feet above the hearth. Poirot thrust his arm inside and encountered only soot and constriction. A cat could not have descended. He straightened, brushing soot from his immaculate cuffs with faint distaste, and turned to the desk. The papers were mostly estate accounts, the handwriting firm until the final page, which ended mid-sentence, and if Klaus should ever return, the law must take its course, though God forgive. The sentence trailed off as though the writer had been interrupted by eternity itself. The brandy glass had left a perfect ring on a blotter. Beside it lay a silver propelling pencil snapped cleanly in two. Poirot lifted the upper half delicately, the lead exposed, still sharp. He sniffed the glass, Remy Martin, good vintage, and beneath it the ghost of something sweeter lilac again, so faint it might have been imagination. Only one object in the room struck him as incongruous. A large gramophone in the corner, its mahogany cabinet polished, its brass horn gleaming like a watchful eye. A record still rested on the turntable, the label faded but legible. Die Weiße Frau, Aufnahme 1891. Poirot wound the handle with cautious fingers and released the brake. A woman's voice, thin and wavering, rose into the chamber, heartbroken, inhuman, climbing to a wail that seemed to scrape the very stones. He stopped it at once. The horn, he noticed, was aimed not into the room, but toward a circular iron grate set high in the wall. A speaking tube, the kind once used to summon servants from distant kitchens. The grate was clear of cobwebs recently used. Poirot stood in the center of the room, eyes half closed, letting the silence settle. Then he performed a small experiment. He took 3 measured steps from door to desk, pivoted, and walked back, studying the dust with his torch. The graph's prints were deep on the outward journey, shallower returning as though he had been weary or fearful. Yet between desk and chair, in the place where a murderer must have stood to drive the blade upward beneath the ribs, the dust lay absolutely smooth, untouched by any weight but time. He exhaled softly. "Impossible," he murmured, Hercule Poirot, to the empty room. "Perfectly, exquisitely impossible. Therefore, my friend, you are lying." Somewhere far below, a clock began to strike 11. The tower answered with its own hollow chime, and for an instant the air seemed to quiver as though the stones themselves leaned inward to listen. Poirot smoothed his mustache, his eyes bright as polished jade. "Very well," he said aloud. "We begin." Chapter 4. Secrets in the Crypt. Poirot descended from the tower as silently as a cat, the iron key to the watchroom now warm in his waistcoat pocket, his mind turning like a well-oiled music box that played only one tune. Impossibility. In the corridor below he met no one. The household had scattered after luncheon with the alacrity of people eager to avoid questions, and the castle felt suddenly enormous, corridors stretching away into shadow, doors closing softly in his wake like conspirators whispering. He did not return to the main hall. Instead, he followed a narrower passage that slanted downward beneath the chapel. Guided by instinct and by the faint smell of candle smoke and damp earth that rose to meet him. Somewhere water dripped with the patience of centuries. The temperature fell until his breath showed white. He buttoned his overcoat, switched on his torch, and went in search of the dead. The Ehrenstein crypt lay behind a low iron grill at the end of a vaulted tunnel where crusader tombs stood in alcoves like stone sentinels, their effigies eroded to anonymity by time and candle soot. Poirot's light picked out Latin inscriptions half defaced, stone gauntlets clutching stone swords, stone faces worn smooth so that only the suggestion of a smile or a scream remained. At the far end, a newer wall had been built across what had once been an archway. The bricks were modern, the mortar pale and still slightly soft to his probing thumbnail. Someone had sealed this recess within the last few months. He ran his fingers along the joints, noting the faint scratches where a trowel had been wiped hastily clean. Fresh work in a place dedicated to the ancient dead. Already the little gray cells purred. From his pocket he drew a slender tool resembling a dentist's probe but stronger, and began to work at the mortar around a single brick near the floor. It came away with surprising ease. The builder had been hurried or careless. 1 brick, 2, 3. Soon he had opened a space large enough to admit his arm. The air that breathed out was colder than the crypt itself and carried the unmistakable reek of wet wool and fresh blood. Poirot steeled himself and reached inside. His gloved fingers encountered oilskin, first a bundle, carefully wrapped, deliberately placed where it would eventually be found. He drew it out into the torchlight and unfolded it with the reverence of a priest opening a reliquary. Inside lay a gentleman's coat of fine, dark broadcloth, cut in the fashion no more than 5 years old, the collar stiff with dried mud from the riverbank. In the right-hand pocket, wrapped in a blood-soaked handkerchief, rested a stiletto, thin, triangular Italian, the kind favored by Renaissance poisoners. The blade was still flecked with brown, and one of the flakes came away beneath his nail, human blood, certainly, and recent. Yet the handkerchief bore an embroidered monogram. KVA. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Klaus von Ehrenstein, the twin no one had mentioned. The coat was too large for the dead Graf, who had been slender. It would have fitted a bigger man, a man perhaps kept hidden for decades. He rewrapped the bundle exactly as he had found it, slid it back into the cavity, and began to replace the bricks with meticulous care, tapping each one home until the wall looked undisturbed once more. Then he sat back on his heels and addressed the darkness in a whisper. "Someone wishes us to discover this little cache, but not yet. A gift for the future, perhaps when suspicion has grown too hot for comfort. A red herring most fragrant prepared with loving care. But Hercule Poirot, he is not so easily hooked." He was not finished. From the deepest recess, something else had caught his light. A thin iron ring set flush into the floor, almost invisible beneath centuries of dust. He brushed the grime away and pulled. A flagstone lifted on concealed hinges, revealing a narrow shaft descending into blackness. A rusted iron ladder was bolted to the wall. The rungs were worn smooth by many hands over many years. The smell that rose was river mud, decay, and again that ghost of lilac. Poirot leaned over the opening, directing his torch downward. 20 feet below, the ladder ended in a low tunnel that appeared to run toward the outer wall of the castle. A secret way, forgotten or deliberately concealed, connecting crypt to riverbank, an escape route for besieged medieval lords, perhaps, or for a living prisoner no one must ever see. He closed the trap with the same silence he had opened it, replaced the dust with a few careful sweeps of his handkerchief, and stood thinking. The castle had lungs, arteries, hidden veins. It breathed and bled in ways its inhabitants had long since ceased to notice. A man could descend from the tower chimney, traverse hidden passages, emerge in the crypt, and leave his incriminating bundle for later discovery, all without once thinking himself unseen. Yet someone had known of these passages, someone alive and cunning and very, very patient. As he turned to leave, his torch caught a final detail, scratched into the mortar of the bricked-up arch. So lightly it might have been the idle mark of a mason, were 2 letters. K and K. Twin initials, mirror images, carved side by side like a promise or a curse. Poirot traced them with one finger, feeling the fresh sharpness of the cuts. The mortar here was barely set. The mark had been made within the last fortnight. Above him, somewhere in the castle's upper reaches, a clock struck the half-hour. The sound rolling down stone throats like a warning. Poirot switched off his torch and stood in absolute darkness, letting the crypt settle around him. Then very softly he spoke to the listening dead. "Your house keeps its secrets well, messieurs, but not, I think, well enough for Hercule Poirot." He climbed the stairs again, brushing mortar dust from his knees, already composing the polite, deadly questions he would ask when the household gathered for dinner. Somewhere in Schloss Ehrenstein, a murderer believed himself safe behind locked doors and ghostly wails. Tonight, Poirot decided, the castle would learn that some doors open from the inside. Chapter 5. The Twin. No one mentioned the library of Schloss Ehrenstein smelled of old leather, candle wax, and fear. A single lamp with a green shade burned on the long table, throwing circles of light across tooled spines and the pale, rigid faces of the household assembled there at Poirot's quiet but implacable request. Outside, the October dusk pressed against the tall windows like a living thing, and every gust of wind rattled the panes as though something begged to be let in. Poirot stood at the head of the table, small, immaculate, lethal in his courtesy, a silver-headed cane resting lightly in his gloved hands. Behind him, on an easel draped in black velvet, waited the object he had carried up from the estate office an hour earlier. No one had yet dared ask what lay beneath the cloth. "Mesdames, messieurs," he began, his voice soft yet carrying to every corner, "we have spoken much of ghosts, of locked doors, of impossible crimes. Tonight we speak of something far more disturbing. Truth." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it creaked. 3 weeks ago, Graf Conrad von Ehrenstein was murdered in a room that could not be entered and could not be left. The German authorities, with their admirable passion for order, declared it suicide. Yet suicide does not bolt doors from within after stabbing itself through the heart. Therefore, we are left with murder, and murder requires a murderer who walks among us, breathing the same air, sharing the same bread. The Dowager Gräfin Irmgard sat ramrod straight, her emeralds flashing each time she breathed. Captain von Richter lounged with calculatedly in his chair, one boot upon the seat of another, but the knuckles of his remaining hand were white upon the table's edge. Dr. Kruger's spectacles winked nervously in the lamplight. Old Marta clutched her rosary as though it were a lifeline. Lieselotte alone met Poirot's gaze steadily, though her pallor had become almost translucent. Poirot continued almost conversationally. This afternoon I spent in the estate archives. The Ehrenstein family, like all great houses, keeps meticulous records. Births, marriages, deaths, even the stillborn. Yet in the year 1884 I found an anomaly. The baptismal register records the birth of twin sons to Graf Albrecht and his wife Sophie Amalie on the 14th of May. The first child, Conrad Maria, is noted in crimson ink air, healthy, lusty cry. The second child, Klaus Albrecht, is entered in black. 7 minutes later, born lifeless, baptized conditionally, buried same day in unconsecrated ground. A tragedy, one thinks. Except, with a flourish, he drew away the black cloth. Beneath it lay a large photograph in a silver frame. 2 infants swaddled in identical christening robes of Brussels lace, held side by a proud father in hussar uniform. The babies were mirror images, dark hair, strong brows, the same imperious curve to the tiny mouths. Only the ribbons distinguished them, crimson for one, black for the other. Except, Poirot repeated softly, the second child was not lifeless at all, merely imperfect. A club foot, perhaps, or the hint of a hair lip, some deformity that, in 1884, would have been considered a stain upon the bloodline. In those days, for noble houses, such problems were solved quietly. A discreet payment to a midwife, a forged death certificate, and the inconvenient twin is spirited away to an asylum in Bavaria, where the family pays an annual pension to keep him hidden forever. Gräfin Irmgard's lips had thinned to a blade. This is obscene fantasy. My brother-in-law had no twin. Poirot turned to her almost pityingly. Madam, the asylum at Schloss Falkenlust near Passau burned to the ground in April 1933. The records were destroyed, but the inmates were not all accounted for. One man, tall, dark with a limp and half his face scarred by fire, walked out of the flames and vanished. The pension payments from the Ehrenstein estate ceased the following month. Curious, n'est-ce pas? Dr. Kruger made a small, choked sound. Captain von Richter's boot slid from the chair with a thud. Poirot placed the photograph gently upon the table. Klaus von Ehrenstein lived. For 52 years he lived in darkness while his brother sat upon the throne that should, by strict primogeniture, have been his. Imagine, if you can, the hatred that grows in such a heart, decades of whispers through barred windows, of servants paid to call him the poor, mad gentleman, of knowing all the while that the world believed him dead and buried. Then the asylum burns, and suddenly he is free, scarred and burning with a grievance older than most nations. Lieselotte's voice was barely audible. You are saying my uncle was killed by his own brother? I am saying, Poirot replied, that somewhere in this castle or very near it Klaus von Ehrenstein hides, waiting for the inheritance that is his by right of blood. And someone in this room has helped him. The silence that followed was so complete that the ticking of the great Ormolu clock sounded like a hammer upon an anvil. Then old Marta began to keen, a low animal sound rocking back and forth. I knew it. I always knew the second cradle was never empty. I rocked them both the night they were born. The little one cried just the same. Gräfin Irmgard rose with imperial fury. "This is intolerable. You will leave my house at once, monsieur." Poirot lifted one small hand. "Madame, I remain at the invitation of the rightful heir, Mademoiselle Lieselotte, and I have not yet finished." He turned to Dr. Kruger, who was sweating freely now. "Doctor, you signed the death certificate for Graf Conrad, did you not? Cause of death: single stab wound to the heart, inflicted by person or persons unknown. Yet you also prescribed increasing doses of Veronal these past months. To calm the Graf's nerves, you said, or to calm the nerves of the man who shared his face." Kruger's mouth opened and closed like a landed carp. Poirot's gaze swept the room. "Klaus is here, perhaps behind a panel, perhaps in the servants' wing wearing a groom's livery, perhaps. And this is most interesting, wearing the very clothes of the man he hated most. The stiletto I found today was wrapped in a coat too large for Conrad, monogrammed KVE. Someone wishes us to believe Klaus is the murderer, but the true murderer wishes us to believe Klaus is the ghost." He let that settle, then added almost gently, "Tonight, when the castle sleeps, the White Lady will cry again. And this time Hercule Poirot will be waiting for her and for the man who pulls her strings." Somewhere high above, the wind rose to a howl, and for an instant every candle in the library dipped as though a door had opened and closed in the dark. Poirot smiled, small and terrible. "The game, mes amis, has only just begun." Chapter 6. The Wailing Corridor. At 11:30 that same night, the castle held its breath. The wind had dropped to an uneasy murmur, the kind that precedes a worse storm, and every shutter in Schloss Ehrenstein hung motionless, as though afraid to rattle. Hercule Poirot sat alone in the upper gallery that ran like a dark artery above the great hall, seated in a high-backed Renaissance chair he had dragged from a corridor, his small person enveloped in a thick plaid traveling rug, a stopwatch in one hand, and an electric torch in the other. He had dismissed the household with gentle finality an hour earlier, refusing offers of brandy, of company, of armed vigilance, in case the ghost should prove substantial. Only Lieselotte had lingered, pale and pleading, until he touched her wrist with paternal reassurance. "Go to bed, mon enfant. Tonight the little gray cells keep watch, and they never sleep." Now the long gallery stretched before him in both directions, black as a mine shaft's, the suits of armor reduced to looming silhouettes. He had chosen this spot with care. It lay directly beneath the West Tower and above the ancient speaking tubes that honeycombed the walls. Sound traveled here with treacherous clarity. A whisper in the chapel floated up to the rafters. A sigh in the library sighed again beside your ear. Poirot sat motionless, eyes half closed, breathing shallow, every sense tuned to the vast stone organism around him. At 11:43, the temperature began to fall. He felt it first on the tips of his ears, then on the backs of his hands, a cold that seemed to rise from the walls themselves. At 11:46, a faint perfume drifted along the gallery lilac, unmistakable now, sweet and cloying as a corpse flower. Poirot did not move, but his thumb rested lightly on the stopwatch button. At precisely 11:47, the first wail rose, thin, heartbreaking, climbing the scale until it became a scream of pure despair that seemed to scrape the marrow from his bones. It came from everywhere and nowhere, welling up through the flagstones, sliding down from the rafters, threading through the arrow slits like smoke. Poirot pressed the stopwatch. The sound lasted 11 seconds exactly, then ceased as abruptly as a gramophone needle lifted. In the ringing silence that followed, he rose, swift and silent as a cat, and walked toward the source, counting his paces. 27 steps brought him to a stretch of paneled wall between two windows where a faded tapestry depicted the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. The tapestry trembled, though there was no draught. He lifted it aside with one finger. Behind it, set flush into the oak, was a small iron grate no larger than a prayer book, another speaking tube. But this one recently polished, the screws bright. From it the lilac smell poured in sickly waves. Poirot placed his ear to the grate and waited. 30 seconds later came a soft mechanical click, then the faintest whir of a spring unwinding. He smiled in the darkness, produced a thin probe from his pocket, and within moments had unscrewed the grate. The tube beyond was wide enough for a man's arm. Inside, a black silk thread ran downward into the wall, taut as a harp string. He pinched it between thumb and forefinger. It vibrated almost imperceptibly, carrying vibration from far below. Poirot followed the thread. It led him along the gallery behind another tapestry, through a concealed door so perfectly concealed that only the silk betraying it would have been missed by any but Poirot. The door opened onto a narrow servant's stair, spiraling downward in utter dark. He descended without lighting his torch, one hand on the wall, counting steps again, 41, 42, until the stair ended in a low, brick-vaulted passage that smelled of coal dust and candle grease. The silk thread continued along the floor, secured at intervals by tiny staples hammered recently into the mortar. At the end of the passage stood a door of plain deal, newly painted. From beneath it seeped a thin blade of yellow light and the soft rhythmic rasp of a gramophone winding down. Poirot knelt, applied his eye to the keyhole, and saw a small chamber lit by a single candle stub, a table, a wind-up gramophone, a stack of records in brown paper sleeves, and coiled upon the floor the black silk thread that had guided him. On the wall hung a crude map of the castle's speaking tubes marked in red ink, and beside it a calendar with every midnight hour crossed through in heavy pencil. The record on the turntable still revolved slowly. The label in spidery German script read, Die Weiße Frau, Aufnahme 1891, Kopie 1936, a copy. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to keep the ghost punctual. Poirot straightened, his face grim with satisfaction. He did not enter. The bird must not be frightened yet. Instead, he retraced his steps, rewinding the silk as he went, replacing the grate, letting the tapestry fall. Back in the gallery, he resumed his seat, restarted the stopwatch, and waited. At 17 minutes after the performance came, the softest scuff of a boot on stone far along the corridor. A figure passed beneath a window where moonlight had momentarily broken through. Tall, limping slightly, carrying something bundled under one arm. The figure paused, listening, then moved on toward the west wing. Poirot noted the silhouette, broad shoulders, a scarf muffling the lower face, and let it go. Timing was everything. He remained in the chair until the castle clock struck 1, then rose, folded his rug with military neatness, and walked softly to the main staircase. On the landing, he paused beside a suit of armor and with delicate fingers lifted the visor. Inside the helm, wedged where no casual glance would find it, lay a second record sleeve empty and a single lilac petal, still fresh. Poirot tucked the petal into his cigarette case and closed the visor again. As he descended toward his room, he spoke aloud to the sleeping house, his voice no more than a breath. "Very good, mon fantôme. You are punctual, you are theatrical, you are almost perfect. But you have made one mistake. You have performed for Hercule Poirot, and Hercule Poirot never forgets a timetable." Far below in the hidden chamber, the candle guttered and went out, leaving only the smell of lilac and hot wax, and the soft click of a door closing with infinite caution. Chapter 7. The Scarred Man. Dawn came late to the stables of Schloss Ehrenstein, sliding in thin gray blades between warped boards, and finding Hercule Poirot already there, Immaculate in a dove-gray overcoat, his Homburg tilted against the mist, standing in the middle of the straw-strewn alley as though he owned every horse in the stalls. The grooms had been sent to the far paddock on contrived errands. Only one man remained, a tall figure in a patched coat, forking hay with slow, deliberate strokes that could not hide the limp in his left leg. He had not heard Poirot enter or pretended not to. The scarred left side of his face was turned away, hidden beneath the brim of a battered felt hat. Poirot waited until the rhythm of the pitchfork faltered, then spoke, soft and precise. "Guten Morgen, Herr Klaus von Ehrenstein. Or do you prefer to be called simply the Ghost?" The pitchfork stopped mid-air. For a long moment the only sound was the nervous stamping of a stallion in the end box. Then the man turned. The left side of his face was a ruined skin puckered and shining from old burns, the ear a melted nub, the eyebrow gone so that the eye socket glared raw and red. Yet the right side was unmistakably the mirror of the dead Graf. The same arrogant nose, the same heavy-lidded eye, though this one burned with a fury decades in the forging. He was taller than Conrad had been, stooped from years in low-ceilinged corridors, and the hand that gripped the pitchfork was missing 2 fingers' fire again, Poirot noted. "You are mistaken, mein Herr," the man said in a voice like gravel soaked in brandy. "My name is Karl Weber. I have papers." "Papers are easily bought," Poirot replied, stepping closer, "but faces are not, especially when they are the face of a man supposed to have died in his cradle. Put down the fork, Herr Klaus. I have no wish to be impaled before breakfast." The pitchfork clattered to the cobbles. Klaus for it was Klaus straightened to his full height, and for an instant the stable seemed to shrink around him. "So the little Belgian knows," he said bitterly. "Does it matter now? Conrad is dead. The title, the castle, the money, all of it should have been mine from the beginning. 7 minutes. 7 minutes older and I would have had everything. Instead, I had stone walls and iron bars and doctors who smiled while they poured drugs down my throat." Poirot regarded him calmly. "You have waited 52 years. You can spare me 5 minutes. How did you come here?" Klaus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The fire was my birthday present. When the asylum burned, I walked out wearing a dead attendant's coat. No one stopped a man with half a face. They looked away. I knew the secret passages. Conrad and I played in them as infants before they took me away. There is a tunnel from the riverbank to the crypt. I came up it like a rat returning to its hole. Conrad never knew. Not until the night I stood behind him in the tower." He touched the scarred cheek almost tenderly. "He recognized me, you know." The great Graf turned in his chair and saw his own face staring back. Older, ruined, alive. He tried to speak, but I was quicker. One thrust here. He placed a maimed hand beneath his own ribs, demonstrating with dreamy precision. Upward, under the sternum. He made no sound at all, only looked surprised as though death were an appointment he had forgotten. Poirot's eyes never left the man's face. And the locked door, the dust, the ghost? "Child's play," Klaus sneered. "A rope treated with phosphorus and saltpeter, lowered from the chimney, then hauled up and burned to nothing in the hearth. The bolt I drew with black thread through the keyhole thread, soaked in acid so it dissolved by morning. The dust was never disturbed because I never touched the floor. As for the White Lady," he shrugged. "Conrad kept the old records for nostalgia. I simply copied them, played them at the proper hour. The speaking tubes did the rest. The servants were terrified. The family half believed already. Fear is a better lock than iron." Poirot nodded slowly. "You hated him enough to plan for years." "Hate?" Klaus's voice cracked. "You think this is hate? I was erased, monsieur. My name struck from the family Bible, my cradle burned, my existence denied so that pretty Conrad could wear velvet and medals. Every birthday I received a cake through the bars, one candle only, because officially I had never been born. When the asylum burned, I swore the world would finally see me. He took a step forward, towering over the small detective. Will you give me to the police now? They will hang me, of course. But the scandal will finish the Ehrensteins forever. The name will rot. That, at least, will be justice. Poirot studied him for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and produced the lilac petal he had found in the armor. You left perfume on your rope, monsieur. A sentimental touch. Lilac for the mother who abandoned you, perhaps? Klaus's ruined face twisted. She used to wear it. I stole a bottle from her dressing table the night they took me away. It was all I had of her. Poirot inclined his head almost with compassion. You have confessed freely. That is well. But understand this. The law is not always the only reckoning. There is still the matter of who hid you these past months, who fed you, who provided the gramophone and the acid and the rope. You are the hand, but someone else held the wrist. Klaus's single eye narrowed. Find them yourself, little man. I will tell you nothing more. Poirot turned to leave, then paused at the stable door where pale morning light now flooded in. One last thing. The stiletto in the crypt, your coat, your monogram, you did not leave it there. No, Klaus said quietly. That was a gift. From someone who wanted you to find me too soon. Poirot nodded once, as though a piece had clicked perfectly, into place. Merci, monsieur. You have been most illuminating. He stepped out into the courtyard, the mist swirling around his polished shoes. Behind him, Klaus von Ehrenstein stood alone among the restless horses, a scarred titan unbound at last, waiting for the rope that would finally make him equal with his twin. Somewhere in the castle, a clock began to strike 7, and the sound rolled across the stables like a funeral bell. Poirot did not look back. Chapter 8. The Reconstruction. The West Tower room had been prepared exactly as it was on the night of the murder. The same high-backed chair placed by the desk, the same brass telescope pointing at the black October sky, the same turkey carpet with its dark, accusing stain. A single lamp burned, throwing long shadows that jittered whenever the wind shook the bars. At Poirot's instruction, the entire household stood in a silent half-circle. Gräfin Irmgard, rigid with disdain, Captain von Richter, pale and sweating, Dr. Kruger clutching his black bag as though it might fly open and betray him, Lieselotte white as parchment, old Marta muttering oaths. In the center, wrists bound behind him with picture cord, stood Klaus von Ehrenstein, the scarred twin, his one good eye fixed on Poirot with the dull acceptance of a man who has already died inside. Poirot moved to the hearth, small, precise, supreme. Mesdames et messieurs, you have demanded the truth. Tonight you shall have it, served cold. We shall watch the crime performed again step by step, so that even the most skeptical among you will see how perfectly murder may imitate the impossible. He gestured, and 2 footmen, forewarned and trembling, wheeled in the reconstructed apparatus. A rope of exact length and thickness, its lower end wrapped in cloth soaked in saltpeter and phosphorus, a spool of black silk thread, a duplicate bolt mechanism mounted on a wooden frame, and the gramophone with its great brass horn aimed at the speaking tube. Klaus watched without expression as the rope was passed up through the chimney and secured to a beam in the attic above exactly 32 feet, the measurement Poirot had taken at dawn. Observe, Poirot said quietly. At 11:46, the murderer, let us call him Klaus for convenience, waits in the attic. He lights the chemical fuse, slow burning, 20 minutes. Then he lowers himself hand over hand down the chimney, the rope wrapped around his body so that his feet never touch the hearth. The fuse burns above, unseen. He lands here. Klaus, at a nod from Poirot, stepped forward and demonstrated, gripping the rope, lifting his full weight with surprising strength in the maimed hands, swinging gently above the hearth before dropping soundlessly onto the carpet. Not a speck of dust stirred. Conrad sits at the desk writing his final sentence. He does not hear the soft arrival because at 11:47 precisely the gramophone in the hidden chamber begins. Poirot wound the machine himself and set the needle. The wail of the White Lady rose, thin, heartbreaking, filling the tower until the windows seemed to vibrate. In that masked moment, Klaus moved behind the chair, drew the stiletto from his sleeve and drove it upward beneath the imagined ribs of the empty seat. He withdrew the blade with a twist, wiped it once on the chair back, and returned to the rope. The wail ends. Silence. Klaus climbs slowly because the rope is beginning to smoke now. He hauls it after him hand over hand. At the attic, the fuse reaches the treated section. The rope flares, burns through in seconds, falls in fragments to the hearth, where the fire consumes what remains. Nothing left but ash, and the smell of lilac, the murderer's sentimental signature rubbed along the rope before descent. The footman hauled the rope up. The prepared section burst into brief green-white flame and parted, the lower half dropping in burning pieces exactly as Poirot described. The air filled with acrid smoke and the ghost of flowers. Now the door, Poirot continued, voice silky. He took the black thread, passed it through the keyhole from the corridor side, looped it round the bolt and retreated into the room, closing the door. With gentle tugs, he drew the bolt home. The iron slid sweetly into its socket. Then he soaked the thread in a small vial of acid from his pocket. Within 30 seconds, the silk dissolved to nothing. He opened the door again and displayed the innocent keyhole. Simple, elegant, undetectable to any but Hercule Poirot. Gräfin Irmgard's voice cut like a whip. A pretty parlor trick, monsieur, but it proves nothing. This, creature has already confessed. Poirot turned to her, eyes glittering. Ah, but confession is not explanation, madame. Klaus performed the murder, yes, yet he did not plan it alone. Someone housed him for 6 months in the hidden chamber behind the pantry. Someone provided the gramophone records, the chemicals, the Italian stiletto. Someone taught him the timetable of the speaking tubes and left the coat and dagger in the crypt so that, when the moment was ripe, Klaus would be sacrificed to protect the true beneficiary. He moved to Dr. Kruger, who shrank against the wall. You, doctor, signed a death certificate you knew to be false. You prescribed Veronal not for the Graf, but for Klaus to keep him docile until the night. And you, madam, turning to the dowager, knew of the twins' existence since childhood. You hated Conrad for inheriting what should have gone to your own son. When Klaus escaped the asylum, you saw your chance. Guide the mad dog to your enemy's throat, then let him hang for it while you claimed moral outrage and kept the emeralds. The dowager's face remained marble, but her hand strayed to the jewels at her throat. Non, Poirot said softly. The true murderer is subtler still. He turned at last to Captain Hans von Richter, who had stood silent, sweat gleaming on his forehead. You, mon capitaine, lost everything to gain. Penniless, decorated, desperate. You discovered Klaus in the tunnels months ago. You fed him the dream of vengeance while you planned the inheritance for yourself, marry Lieselot, control the estate, silence the mad uncle forever. The coat in the crypt was yours, monogram carefully altered. You staged the evidence when suspicion grew too warm, but you forgot one detail. He produced the lilac petal from his cigarette case. Klaus kept lilac for his mother. You kept it for your mistress in Munich, who wears nothing else. The petal in the armor was fresh 2 days ago after Klaus had already been locked in the wine cellar under guard. Only you passed that way. Von Richter's face convulsed. He lunged for the window, but the footmen were ready. He was borne struggling to the floor, cursing in 2 languages. Poirot looked down at him almost sadly. You used a ghost to murder, Capitaine. But ghosts, like justice, have a way of turning in the hand. Above them the wind rose again, rattling the bars like desperate fingers. The tower room seemed suddenly colder, as though something had listened and, satisfied, withdrawn. Poirot smoothed his moustache and addressed the stunned assembly. The impossible crime, mes amis, is explained. The rest is for the police. He turned the gramophone handle one last time. The White Lady began to wail, but this time no one flinched. The spell was broken, and the castle, for the first time in centuries, stood silent. Chapter 9. Motive and Madness. The great hall had never felt so small. Torches guttered in their iron sconces, throwing restless light over the ancient banners and the faces that only yesterday had worn the easy masks of rank and breeding, now stripped away, leaving raw flesh beneath. Captain Hans von Richter sat bound to a high-backed chair that had once seated Crusader knights, his uniform tunic unbuttoned, the iron cross dangling like a noose at his throat. Dr. Kruger stood behind him, wrists tied, spectacles fogged with terror, repeating the same sentence over and over in a cracked whisper. I only wanted to help. I only wanted to help. Klaus von Ehrenstein had been placed apart near the fireplace, still unbound, Poirot had insisted, the scarred Titan watching the only calm figure in the room, as though justice, having finally found him, had also granted him a strange peace. Poirot walked slowly before them, hands clasped behind his back. The soft click of his patent shoes, the only sound above the doctor's litany and the wind mourning in the chimneys. We have seen how the crime was committed, he began, voice quiet yet carrying to the vaulted roof. Now we must see why, and the why, mesdames et messieurs, is always uglier than the how. He stopped in front of Klaus. You, monsieur, hated with the purity of a child robbed of sunlight. 52 years of darkness forged a perfect weapon. You needed no persuasion to kill your brother. You only needed opportunity. That opportunity was given to you deliberately, lovingly, by the man who sits there. He turned to von Richter. Captain, you came here 6 months ago with a beggar's smile and a gambler's debts. The Graf refused you money. He laughed at your war record, called you a parasite on the family name. You left his study white with rage and walked the corridors until you found the hidden door behind the pantry. There he was, the living ghost, the mad twin eating crusts in the dark like a rat. You saw not a monster but a miracle. You fed him, clothed him, told him stories of the brother who had stolen his birthright. And slowly you taught him a different story. That if Conrad died without issue, Lieselotte would inherit, and the man who married Lieselotte would control everything. You promised Klaus revenge and freedom. You promised yourself a castle. Von Richter spat blood where the footman had struck him. Pretty words, Belgian, prove it. Poirot produced a small leather-bound ledger from his pocket and let it fall open. Your own hand, Capitaine. Found this morning in your room. Debts to Jewish moneylenders in Berlin, 300,000 marks. Forged signatures of the Graf guaranteeing repayment. When he discovered the forgeries, he threatened exposure. You had 1 week before ruin, 1 week to become either master of Schloss Ehrenstein or a fugitive. He moved to Dr. Kruger, and you, doctor, were the perfect accomplice, weak, greedy, already in von Richter's pay. You diagnosed the Graf with nervous exhaustion to explain his growing reclusiveness while Klaus took his place at certain windows, certain nights. You supplied the Veronal to keep Klaus docile between rehearsals. You signed false certificates, falsified asylum records when questions about the fire arose. For this you were promised a quiet clinic in the Black Forest and freedom from the debts that have haunted you since 1918. Kruger sank to his knees, spectacles falling to the flags with a clink. He said no one would be hurt, only frightened. Then inheritance. I believed him. The dowager's voice rang out, cold as winter steel. You believed a one-armed scoundrel because you are a coward and a fool. My contempt for Conrad lived with every day. It did not kill him. These men did. Poirot inclined his head. Précisément, madame. Your hatred was honest. Theirs was mercenary. He turned last to Klaus. And you, monsieur, were the perfect instrument, mad enough to kill, sane enough to follow instructions. Yet even you were to be discarded. The coat in the crypt, the stiletto with your monogram placed there 3 days ago while you slept drugged. When the police came, the mad twin would be found, confess, hang, and the captain would comfort the grieving heiress into marriage, a perfect crime almost. Klaus lifted his ruined face. For the first time he spoke without bitterness. I wanted him to see me, just once. When he turned in the chair and knew who held the knife, that was enough. The rest, inheritance, marriage, money, was never mine to want. I only wanted him to know my name before he died. Silence fell, broken only by Kruger's soft sobbing. Lieselotte stepped forward, eyes burning in her white face. You used my uncle's brother as a weapon. You used me as bait. Was nothing sacred? Von Richter laughed, a cracked, ugly sound. Sacred in this Germany? There is only strength and weakness. I chose strength. Poirot's voice cut like a scalpel. Then you chose badly, monsieur. Strength that builds on madness and murder collapses at the first touch of truth. He signaled to the footman. Take the captain and the doctor to the gun room. Lock it from outside. The police will arrive from Heidelberg by noon tomorrow. As for Herr Klaus, he looked at the scarred man for a long moment. He will remain here tonight under my supervision. There has been enough betrayal of blood. Klaus met his gaze and astonishingly gave a small nod, almost of gratitude. Gräfin Irmgard rose, emeralds flashing as she swept toward the staircase. At the first step she paused. And the ghost, monsieur? Will she wail again tonight? Poirot smiled, small and sad. The White Lady has delivered her message, madame. She came for a death that happened long ago, the death of a child denied his name. Tonight she rests. But even as he spoke, a breath of air stirred the banners carrying the faintest trace of lilac. And old Marta crossed herself thrice, whispering that some griefs are too old to be laid by any living hand. Poirot did not contradict her. He simply watched the prisoners taken away, then turned to Lieselotte and offered his arm. Come, mademoiselle. Dawn is not far. Let us walk in the courtyard and wait for the sane light of morning. Behind them, Klaus von Ehrenstein stood alone before the dying fire, scarred face lit from below like a tragic mask, and for the first time in 52 years he spoke his own name aloud, softly, wonderingly, into the empty hall. The stones did not answer, but the wind for once did not deny him either. Chapter 10. The Little Gray Cells. Triumph dawn crept over the Neckar in thin ribbons of rose and ash, finding Hercule Poirot already on the eastern terrace, gloved hands resting on the balustrade, eyes fixed on the river far below where mist still clung like a half-remembered sorrow. The castle behind him lay quiet for the first time since his arrival. No whale had risen at midnight, no gramophone had turned, no lilac had perfumed the corridors. The White Lady had kept her silence, as though satisfied that the older wound, the living burial of a child, had finally been acknowledged. Poirot's breath plumed gently in the cold. He had not slept, yet his moustache remained magnificent, his spine straight. the little gray cells serene now. That order had been restored. Lieselotte joined him, wrapped in a dark cloak, her face no longer bloodless but touched with the faint color of relief and exhaustion mingled. She carried 2 steaming cups. He accepted one with a small bow, inhaling the aroma of real coffee with the gratitude of a man who had lived too long on ersatz. "It is finished," she said quietly. "The police came at first light. Captain von Richter screamed curses all the way to the van. Dr. Kruger wept and tried to kiss the sergeant's boots, and Klaus—" Her voice faltered. Poirot sipped, watching a lone barge slide beneath the old bridge. "Klaus asked to see the family crypt before they took him. I permitted it. He stood a long time before the newest plaque, Conrad's, and laid upon it the single lilac bloom he had carried since childhood. Then he turned to me and said very calmly, 'Tell my niece the castle is hers now, untainted.' I was never a ghost, only a man too late. After that he went with the policeman without chains." Lieselotte's eyes filled. "They will hang him." "They will," Poirot agreed softly. "But he will walk to the scaffold with his true name on the warrant for the first time in his life. For Klaus, that is a kind of victory." She was silent a long while, then asked the question that had kept her awake. "And the dowager?" "My great-aunt knew of Klaus since we were children. She admitted it last night. Yet she did nothing." Poirot set his cup on the stone parapet. "Madame la Gräfin is of the old world. She believed an imperfect child was a judgment upon the house. Silence was her duty, she thought. When Klaus returned, she saw only a weapon that fate had placed in von Richter's hand. She did not wield it, but she did not blunt it either. That is a sin of omission, mademoiselle, and those are tried in a different court." A bell rang faintly from the gatehouse, the postern opening. A black police wagon rolled into the courtyard below. Uniformed men climbed out, speaking in low voices with the steward. Poirot watched them with detachment. "You leave today?" Lieselotte asked. "The noon train to Basel, thence to Istanbul. There is a little matter on the Orient Express that requires the attention of Poirot. But before I go, I have a gift for you." He reached into his overcoat and produced a small Morocco case. Inside, on faded velvet, lay a miniature enamel medal, the double-headed eagle of the Ehrensteins, but with one head broken away. "I found this in the hidden chamber. Klaus wore it against his skin all his life. The ribbon is worn to threads. He asked that you keep it not as heirloom, but as reminder. That blood is not always destiny, and mercy is sometimes the only reparation left to the living." She took it with trembling fingers. "What will happen to the castle now? It is yours to decide. Sell it, burn it, open it to tourists who wish to shiver at ghosts, it is all the same. But I think you will keep it. Stones remember, mademoiselle, but they also heal when the poison is drawn." They stood without speaking as the sun cleared and the river turned from steel to silver. Somewhere below, the great door boomed shut behind the departing prisoners, and the sound rolled up the cliff like a final amen. Lieselotte drew a breath that seemed to come from the roots of the castle itself. "You told us once that justice is sometimes only a colder than revenge. Was this justice, Monsieur Poirot?" He considered, twirling his mustache with delicate satisfaction. "It was order restored, which is the only justice Hercule Poirot ever promises. The rest forgiveness, redemption, the laying of ghosts that belongs to hearts larger than mine." A train whistle echoed up the valley, distant but clear. Poirot drained his cup, placed it beside hers on the parapet, and offered his arm. "Come, I will accompany you to the gate. It is not good for the new mistress of Schloss Ehrenstein to stand alone when the old shadows leave." Together they descended the terrace steps, 2 small figures against the vast facade, while behind them the castle slowly woke to an ordinary morning. Ravens on the battlements, smoke from the kitchens, the faint clatter of pots where life, unromantic and persistent, prepared breakfast. At the carriage, Poirot paused. One last thing. The gramophone record, the original 1891 pressing, I have taken the liberty of destroying. Copies may exist, but the true voice of Anna von Ehrenstein has cried enough. Let her sleep. Lieselotte bent suddenly and kissed his cheek, a gesture so swift he had no time to protest. "Thank you, little uncle," she whispered, the childhood name she had given him in the sleepless nights. Poirot colored to the roots of his hair, cleared his throat, and climbed into the waiting Daimler with immense dignity. As the car swept beneath the archway, he leaned out once, raising his hat. "Adieu, mademoiselle. Remember, the impossible is only the possible we have not yet understood. And lilac, after all, blooms only in spring." The car disappeared down the winding road. Lieselotte stood in the courtyard until the sound of the engine faded into the river's voice. Then she looked up at the west tower, where the morning light now struck full upon the bars, and for the first time in her memory the windows did not look blind, but merely empty, waiting to be filled with ordinary human life again. High above, a single rook wheeled against the pale sky and flew eastward, following the train. Somewhere in the walls, a loose shutter banged once, twice, then was still. The castle exhaled, long and slow, like a sleeper turning over after a centuries-long nightmare, and settled into silence. The White Lady did not wail again that night, nor any night after. But on certain spring evenings, when the lilac bushes below the chapel burst into flower, the scent drifted upward through the speaking tubes and lingered in the corridors, gentle now, almost a blessing, until even the oldest servant smiled and said the castle had finally forgiven itself. And far away in a first-class compartment rolling toward the Bosphorus, Hercule Poirot opened his newspaper, saw the small paragraph about a prisoner found hanged in his Heidelberg cell, folded the page with neat finality, and murmured to the window, "Some ghosts, mon ami, refuse to be laid. But at least they are honest ghosts." Then he ordered a sirop de cassis from the attendant, twirled his mustache once more, and turned his formidable mind to the next impossible crime waiting beyond the mountains.